Tonight we set something down. Not a task, not a burden you carry in your hands, but something quieter and more stubborn than that. The wish to make your mind stop. If you are here tonight because your thoughts will not lie still, because the moment your head touches the pillow, 100 small voices start speaking at once. About tomorrow, about something said years ago, about nothing at all, then you are exactly where this evening wants you to be. We are going to spend these hours with a very old and very gentle teaching, one that Zen masters have offered for centuries to restless students in the middle of the night. And the teaching, stripped down to its plainest form, is this. You do not have to fight your way into stillness. You only have to stop stirring the water and let it settle on its own. We will walk through this together slowly, through a handful of quiet stories. A monk watching his own busy mind the way you might watch weather passing over a mountain. Thoughts drifting like clouds across a dark and enormous sky. Mud in a jar of water that no one hurries because it does not need to be hurried. None of these stories will ask anything of you. There is no lesson to memorize, no technique to master before you're allowed to rest. You are simply going to listen, the way you might listen to rain starting on a roof, and let whatever wants to settle in you settle, in its own time at its own pace. Before we begin, if you like, feel free to share in the comments what time it is where you are, and where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's a small thing, but it's nice to know how far these words are traveling, while so many of us lie awake at the same time, in different corners of the dark. And if you would like to carry these quiet hours with you when you're away from a screen, this channel is also on Spotify. You'll find the link waiting for you in the description below, so these same slow teachings can follow you into other nights. You do not need to know anything about Buddhism to be here. You do not need to remember a single word of what follows. If your attention drifts, that is not a failure. It is, in fact, rather close to the whole point. The teaching tonight is not about gripping an idea tightly enough to keep it. It is about loosening your grip on everything, including the idea itself, and trusting that something in you already knows how to rest. So wherever you are lying right now, let yourself settle in a little further. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let your jaw loosen, just slightly, the way it does in the last moment before sleep, when you're not holding your face a certain way anymore. Take one slow breath in, and let it go longer than feels quite necessary. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight. There is nothing here that needs solving. Let us begin. There is a kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with the body. You can lie down after the longest day, muscles aching, eyes heavy, every part of you asking for sleep, and still the mind will not lie down with you. It keeps working. It replays a conversation from the afternoon, adjusting the words you wish you'd said. It drafts tomorrow's list, then drafts it again, as if a third version will finally be the one that lets you rest. It reaches back to something someone said 5 years ago and turns it over, for no reason at all, as though it has just now noticed a splinter it forgot to remove. If this sounds familiar, you are not unusual, and you are not doing anything wrong. You have simply arrived tonight at one of the oldest and most human predicaments there is. The predicament of a mind that will not stop, held by a body that desperately wants it to. Most of us respond to this the same way. We try to make the mind stop the way we would stop a faucet, by turning something firmly until the flow ceases. We tell ourselves sternly to relax. We command the thoughts to be quiet. We grit our attention against them like a hand closing around water, trying to hold it still by force. And most of us have noticed, if we are honest, that this rarely works. In fact, it tends to make things worse. The more forcefully we try to silence the mind, the louder and more insistent it seems to become, as though it were a child who has just been told, harshly, to stop talking, and who now has something new to think about. The harshness, the failure, the fact that it still hasn't stopped. This is where tonight's teaching begins, with a simple observation that the Zen tradition has returned to again and again across many centuries. The effort to force the mind still is itself a kind of noise. It does not belong to the quiet you're seeking. It belongs to the very busyness you're trying to escape. You cannot outmuscle a racing mind, because the muscling is racing too. There is a story told of a young monk who came to his teacher in real distress. He had been sitting in meditation every day for months, he explained, and still his mind would not settle. If anything, it seemed busier than when he'd begun. Thoughts arrived in a steady, restless stream. Memories, plans, worries, stray fragments of songs he didn't even like. And no matter how hard he tried to push them away, they kept coming, one after another, like waves that would not stop breaking. I sit very still, the young monk said. I close my eyes. I hold my back straight. I have done everything you taught me, and still my mind will not be quiet. What am I doing wrong? The old teacher was quiet for a while. He was an elderly man who lived in a small wooden hut at the edge of the monastery grounds, and it was said that he had once been just as restless as any student who came to him, that his own stillness, whatever it was now, had not come easily or quickly. He looked at the young monk with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite amusement, but a little of both. Tell me, the teacher said, what have you been doing exactly when the thoughts come? I push them away, the young monk said. I catch myself thinking, and I say, no, not that, be still, and I try again. And does this work? The young monk hesitated. For a moment, then another thought comes, and I push that one away too. It is exhausting. I feel as though I am at war with my own mind. The teacher nodded slowly, as if this were exactly what he'd expected to hear. He rose from his seat, walked to a shelf near the wall of his hut, and returned carrying a wide clay jar filled with water. He set it down on the low table between them. The water in the jar was murky and brown, clouded with dirt and fine sediment, so that nothing beneath the surface could be seen at all. This water is like your mind tonight, the teacher said, full of things stirred up. Can you see to the bottom of it? No, the young monk admitted. Then help me, the teacher said. Make it clear. Use your hands if you must. Stir it, if that will help. The young monk looked at him uncertainly, but did as he was told. He reached into the jar and stirred the water with his fingers, swirling it one way and then another, as though trying to chase the cloudiness out through sheer motion. The water only grew murkier. Small particles of dirt rose from the bottom and spread through it in dark ribbons. He stirred harder, faster, his brow furrowing with the effort, and the water became darker still, thick with sediment, until it was almost the colour of the clay jar that held it. It is getting worse, the young monk said, frustrated. The harder I try, the less clear it becomes. Yes, the teacher said simply. Now stop. The young monk withdrew his hand and sat back, breathing a little heavily, watching the water swirl and eddy in the jar from the force of his stirring. It did not look at all like it was becoming clear. If anything, in that first moment after he stopped, it looked as murky as ever, maybe more so, dark clouds of dirt still hanging suspended through it. "Now what?" the young monk asked. "Now," said the teacher, "we wait." They sat together in silence. The teacher did not instruct the young monk to do anything at all, not to breathe a certain way, not to think a certain thought, not even to watch the jar particularly closely. He simply let the silence continue, the two of them sitting on either side of the low table, the jar of clouded water between them, while outside the hut the late afternoon light moved slowly across the floor. Minutes passed. The young monk found his attention drawn back to the jar every so often, and each time he looked, the water seemed a little less turbulent than before, though he could not have said exactly when the change had happened. The particles that had been spinning near the surface began, very slowly, to drift downward. The dark ribbons of sediment that had spread through the water began to gather again, low, near the bottom, rather than swirling everywhere at once. No one had touched the jar. No one had done anything to the water at all, except leave it alone. After perhaps 20 minutes, the water had cleared enough that the young monk could make out the shape of his own finger, if he held it just above the surface and looked down through the water toward the bottom of the jar. The sediment had settled into a soft layer at the base, and above it, the water sat clear and still, undisturbed, as though it had never been murky at all. "It settled on its own," the young monk said, with something like wonder in his voice. "I didn't do anything." "That," the teacher said, "is the whole of the teaching. You did not do anything. That is precisely why it settled." The young monk turned this over in his mind. "But surely," he said slowly, "if I hadn't filled the jar with murky water in the first place, if I hadn't stirred it—" "You did not fill it," the teacher said, not unkindly. "The mud was already there at the bottom, before either of us touched it. All water carries sediment, if you look closely enough. The question was never how to have a jar with no mud in it. The question is only this: when the mud rises, as it always will, do you stir it further, or do you let it rest?" The young monk looked back down at the water, clearer now, the fine layer of sediment resting undisturbed at the bottom of the jar. "When you sit and try to force your mind still," the teacher continued, "you are doing exactly what your hand did in that water. You are stirring and calling it stillness, because the stirring is disguised as effort, and effort feels like it should be doing something useful. But a mind, like water, does not clear because it is stirred harder. It clears because it is finally left alone. This is not, it should be said, a teaching that says thoughts are bad, or that a busy mind is some kind of failure to be ashamed of. The mud is not the enemy in this story. The mud belongs to the water. It was always going to be there, stirred up by the ordinary business of living, the small collisions of a day, a hurried morning, a hard conversation, a worry about tomorrow that has nowhere else to go but into the mind at night. The teaching is not that you should have no mud. It is that mud, given no reason to keep moving, comes to rest by itself, and that a mind is not so different from that water. You have likely felt some version of this yourself, even if you never had words for it. Think of the times you have tried hardest to fall asleep, commanding yourself, be still, stop thinking, go to sleep now. And how those were so often the very night sleep refused to come. And think too of the times sleep arrived almost without your noticing. On some ordinary evening when you weren't fighting for it at all, when you simply let your eyes close and your attention drift without demanding anything of it. The difference was never in how tired you were. It was in whether you were stirring the water or letting it rest. Tonight, you do not need to stop your thoughts. You do not need to win any war against your own busy mind. If a thought comes, a worry, a memory, some stray unfinished fragment from the day, let it come. Do not chase it away, and do not chase after it either. Just let it move through, the way sediment moves through water when no hand disturbs it, drifting downward on its own, settling low at its own unhurried pace. There is nothing you need to do right now except stop stirring. It can help, at this point, to notice what stirring actually feels like in the body, because it rarely announces itself as clearly as the young monk's hand did in that jar of water. It is subtler than that most nights. It might be a slight tightening across the forehead, a small clench somewhere behind the eyes, as though you were squinting at a thought to make it behave. It might be a kind of leaning forward in the chest, an eagerness to get ahead of the next worry before it fully arrives, to head it off, to solve it in advance so it cannot trouble you later. It might simply be the breath itself, held a little higher and a little tighter than it needs to be, as though some part of you were bracing for whatever comes next. None of these are things to criticize yourself for noticing. They are simply the hand in the water, doing what hands do when they believe stirring is the same thing as helping. And once you notice the stirring, you do not need to fight it either. That would only be one more hand added to the jar. You only need to notice it, the way the young monk noticed his own fingers moving through the murky water, and let the noticing itself be enough. Often, simply seeing clearly that you are stirring is the very thing that allows the hand to loosen and finally withdraw. Let your forehead soften now, if it has been holding anything. Let your jaw rest, heavier than before. Let your shoulders sink a little further into whatever is beneath you. The mattress, the pillow, the weight of the day finally being given somewhere to go. You do not need to hold yourself a certain way to be allowed to rest. You do not need to arrange your thoughts into any particular order before sleep is permitted to come. The jar does not ask its water to arrange itself. It only asks for stillness, and even that is not really an asking. It is simply what happens on its own the moment nothing more is added to disturb it. If you notice, even now, some quiet urge to check whether you're doing this correctly, whether you are settling fast enough, whether the stirring has really stopped, let that urge be one more small ripple, and let it pass the same way. There is no examination here, no grade being given at the end of the evening. There is only water and mud, and the very old, very reliable fact that mud always sinks, given time, whether or not anyone is watching it happen. Let us rest here for just a moment. There is nothing to solve, nothing to prove, nowhere the mind is required to arrive. If it is still busy, that is all right. Busyness is only mud that has not yet had the chance to settle. Take one slow breath and let it go a little longer than feels necessary, and simply notice, without changing anything, however clear or however clouded things feel right now. There is no wrong answer. Let your attention travel slowly downward, the way sediment travels downward in a jar left undisturbed. Notice the crown of your head heavy against the pillow. Notice your eyes resting in their sockets without needing to hold any particular shape. Notice your throat, your chest, rising and falling on their own. There is no part of you that needs to be arranged differently right now. Everything is already exactly where it is meant to be for this moment, settling at its own pace, the way water always finds its own level, given enough time and enough quiet. When you are ready, we will continue together and look more closely at what it might mean to truly stop stirring, not just the mind, but the many small ways we keep reaching for a stillness we are, at the very same moment, disturbing with our reaching. There is no rush to get there at all tonight. The jar is still quietly settling on its own, exactly as it should. Let it. There is another way of seeing this same trouble, one that a different teacher might have offered the same restless student, using a different image entirely. Where the last one spoke of water and the mud that clouds it, this one speaks of sky and something that has been passing through it, unnoticed, for as long as there have been minds to notice anything at all. Picture for a moment a vast open sky, the kind you might see from a high mountain pass or from a small boat far out on still water, where there is nothing to interrupt the view in any direction. Clouds move across the sky like this constantly. Some are heavy and dark, carrying rain, moving slowly, seeming almost to press down on everything beneath them. Others are thin and pale, barely more than a smudge of white, gone again within minutes. Some clouds arrive suddenly, out of a clear stretch of blue, and vanish just as suddenly. Others linger for what feels like hours, grey and low, so that you begin to believe the sky has always looked this way and will always look this way, that this is simply what the sky is now. But it never is. However long a particular cloud stays, however dark or heavy or convinced of its own permanence it seems, it always passes. It has never once, in the whole history of skies, managed to stay. And underneath it, behind it, if that is even the right word for something with no true behind, the sky itself does not change at all. The sky was never grey. The sky was never heavy with rain. The sky only ever held the cloud for a while, the way a room holds a guest who will eventually leave, and the sky remained exactly what it always was, whether anyone was there to notice it in the gaps between clouds or not. This is, in the Zen and Buddhist traditions, one of the oldest and gentlest ways of describing what a thought actually is, and, more importantly, what you actually are underneath the thinking. Your thoughts, in this teaching, are the clouds. They arrive, sometimes gently, and sometimes as a heavy front rolling in from somewhere you can't quite locate. They pass through your awareness, some drifting quickly, some lingering with what feels like real weight and real permanence, and underneath them, behind them, holding them without effort the way sky holds weather. There is something in you that doesn't change at all. It is sometimes called awareness itself, or simply the mind's true nature, though these are only pointing words, fingers gesturing at something that is far easier to notice directly than to describe. There is a story that is often told to illustrate this, of a student who came to a teacher deeply troubled by the state of his own thinking. He had, he said, spent years now trying different methods to calm his mind, breathing exercises, long periods of sitting in silence, walks through the forest meant to soothe him, and none of it had worked for very long. His thoughts always returned. Worse, he said, they seemed to multiply the more he tried to notice them, as though observing his own mind only gave it more material to work with. I feel, the student said, as though I will never have a clear mind. There are simply too many clouds. They never stop coming. The teacher, it is said, did not respond right away. Instead, she led the student outside to a wide clearing at the edge of the monastery grounds, where the trees opened onto open sky, and they both lay down on their backs in the grass, looking straight up. It was a day with a great deal of weather moving through. Clouds of every size and shade, some racing quickly across the blue, others heavy and slow, a few scattered spots of true dark grey that looked as though they might carry rain before the afternoon was through. Tell me what you see, the teacher said. Clouds, the student said. A great many clouds, some large, some small. It looks like it might rain later from that dark one there. And the sky itself, the teacher said, is it troubled by all this? The student was quiet for a moment, watching. I don't understand the question, he admitted. The sky is just there. It isn't doing anything. The clouds are the ones moving. Yes, the teacher said. And has the sky ever, in your experience, become a cloud? Has it ever been so overrun with weather that it stopped being sky and simply became one enormous permanent storm? The student almost laughed at the strangeness of the question. No, of course not. However much weather passes through, there is still sky. The clouds move on. The sky is always there, whether it's a clear day or the worst storm you've ever seen. Then consider, the teacher said, still looking upward, her voice as unhurried as the clouds themselves, that your thoughts are the weather, and you, the part of you that is aware of the thoughts, that can notice them coming and watch them go. You are the sky. You have been mistaking yourself all this time for the clouds. You look at a difficult thought, a heavy dark one that seems as though it will never pass, and you say, this is my mind. This is who I am right now. I am this storm. But you were never the storm. You were only ever what held it, without strain, the way this sky is holding everything we can see right now, without the smallest bit of effort. The student turned this over slowly, still watching the clouds drift by above them, one enormous slow shape breaking apart at its edges into smaller pieces as it moved. But some of the clouds feel very heavy, he said eventually. Some of my thoughts, when they come, feel as though they could really rain on me, as though they might actually change something. It is not so easy to remember I am the sky when a storm feels this real. No, the teacher agreed. It is not easy, especially at first. A heavy cloud can look from beneath it, as though it fills the whole sky, as though there is no blue left anywhere, as though it has always been this way and always will be. That is simply what it is to stand or lie directly underneath weather. But have you ever flown above the clouds in an airplane on a day when the ground below was grey and overcast and raining? The student nodded. He had once, years before. Then you know, the teacher said, that above even the heaviest, most complete-looking storm, the sky is still blue. It was blue the entire time you were standing beneath the clouds, feeling as though the whole world had gone grey. The storm never actually reached that high. It only looked from underneath, like it filled everything. This is perhaps one of the more difficult things to trust about a busy or troubled mind at night. That however total a particular worry feels, however much it seems to fill every available space of your attention until there is no room left for anything else. It has never actually been the whole sky. It has only ever been weather passing through a much larger space, a space that has been quietly present the entire time, undisturbed, whether you are aware of it or not. You do not need to argue with a thought to prove this to yourself. You do not need to push a difficult cloud out of the sky, or wrestle it into a different shape, or convince it to leave sooner than it wants to. You only need to remember, gently, softly, without forcing anything, that you are not required to become the cloud simply because it has arrived. You can notice it. You can watch it drift, heavy or light, dark or pale, moving at whatever pace it moves at. And you can trust, the way you trust that weather always eventually clears, even on the days when it feels endless, that it will pass, because that is simply what clouds do. It is the nature of a cloud to move on. It has never once stayed. There is a kind of relief available in this, even on the nights when your mind feels most crowded, most restless, most convinced that there will never be a clear space again. You do not have to clear the sky yourself. You do not have to hunt down every cloud and dismiss it one by one before you're allowed to rest. You only have to remember that you were sky long before the first cloud arrived tonight, and you will still be sky long after the last one has drifted past, however many hours that takes. Some nights the clouds move quickly, and the sky clears within minutes of lying down. Other nights, the weather sits heavier, and it takes longer, a whole hour sometimes, of watching thought after thought pass through before things finally begin to feel open again. Both are completely normal. Neither is a failure. The sky does not judge itself for how long a storm lasts. It simply remains sky throughout, patient in a way that costs it nothing. Notice that you are the one noticing, that noticing itself, quiet and unclouded, has been here the entire time, underneath everything. However busy the sky above it has looked tonight, there's a smaller, quieter version of this same lesson that you can practice tonight without needing to remember any of it tomorrow. It has to do with where you place your attention when a thought arrives, not on the thought's content, which will pull you in and hold you there for as long as you let it, but on its edges. Every thought, however heavy, has a beginning and eventually an end. It arrives, it occupies your attention for some stretch of time, and then, if left alone, it thins out and dissolves, the way a cloud's edges soften and blur into the surrounding blue before it disappears entirely. If you can find even a small part of your attention willing to notice this, not fighting the thought, not following its story all the way to the end, just quietly registering that it is a shape with a beginning and an end, moving through a much larger space, you will often find it passes more quickly than it would have otherwise. This is not a trick for making thoughts disappear on command. It will not always work, and some nights the sky stays crowded for a long while no matter how gently you watch it. But there is something in the simple noticing. This is a cloud. It is moving. It will not stay. That tends to loosen the grip a thought has on you. The same way naming a feeling out loud to a friend can sometimes make it lighter to carry, even though nothing about the feeling itself has changed. You might also notice, if you pay attention over many nights rather than just this one, that certain clouds return again and again, familiar shapes, old worries that seem to circle back on a kind of private weather pattern of their own. This too is simply how skies work. Certain patterns of wind bring certain kinds of weather through certain valleys, season after season, and there is no shame in a familiar storm returning. Even if you had hoped this time, it might skip you by. The sky does not resent a recurring storm. It only continues being sky, patient in the way that costs it nothing, through every version of every storm it has ever held. Let your eyes soften now if they are open, or let them stay closed if they already are. Feel the weight of your own body being fully held by whatever is beneath you, the way the sky is held by nothing at all, and yet never falls. There is nothing above you tonight that will not eventually pass. There is nothing so heavy in your mind right now that it has become the whole of the sky, however convincing it may have felt for a while. Let us rest here for a few breaths. There is no cloud you are required to dismiss, and no clear sky you are required to force into being. Simply notice, without changing anything, how much space there already is around whatever thought happens to be passing through right now. That space was never empty of anything real. It is, if anything, the most real part of all of this, quieter than any single thought, wider than any storm, and entirely unbothered by how long tonight's weather takes to clear. Breathe in and imagine the breath itself rising like a slow current of warm air beneath a cloud, lifting it ever so slightly on its way. Breathe out and let the cloud drift a little further along on that same current, not pushed, not chased, simply carried by something far larger and far calmer than the cloud itself. You do not need to know where any particular thought is going. You only need to keep breathing, slow and unhurried, and trust that the sky above you has carried heavier weather than this before, and will carry this too wherever it needs to go. When you are ready, we will continue on and look at what happens when we do try to chase a cloud away. When the mind, instead of simply watching weather pass, decides the weather is a problem to be solved and picks up a second kind of trouble entirely, one that has nothing to do with the first. Rest here as long as you need to before we go on together. The sky is not going anywhere tonight, and neither tonight do you need to go anywhere at all, or become anything other than exactly what you already are. And so we come to that question of what happens when we do try to chase a cloud away, when the mind decides that a thought arriving is not simply weather passing through, but a problem, something wrong, something that should not be happening, something to be argued with immediately. This is where a very old teaching becomes useful, one of the clearest and most practical the Buddhist tradition has ever offered, and it begins with an arrow. It is said that the Buddha once asked his students a simple question. Suppose, he said, a man is struck by an arrow. This is painful, of course. An arrow is a painful thing to be struck by, whatever else is true. But suppose that immediately after the first arrow strikes him, a second arrow strikes the very same spot. Is this second wound any less painful than the first? No, the students agreed. If anything, a second arrow in the same wound would be far worse. And this, the teaching goes, is very often what we do to ourselves, not with actual arrows, but with our own minds. Life sends the first arrow regularly and without asking permission. A worry arrives. A memory surfaces that we didn't invite. Sleep will not come, though the body is exhausted and the hour is late. This first arrow is simply part of being alive with a mind that thinks. It is not a punishment, and it is not evidence of anything having gone wrong. It is only what it is. A moment of discomfort, ordinary and unavoidable. The kind every person who has ever tried to sleep has felt at some point in their life. But then, so often, a second arrow follows immediately behind the first, and this one we fire ourselves. We notice the racing thought, and instead of simply letting it be a racing thought, we add, "Why can't I stop thinking? What is wrong with me tonight? I have work tomorrow. I need to sleep. Why does this always happen to me?" This second arrow has nothing to do with the original thought at all. It is a fresh wound, self-inflicted, layered directly on top of the first, and it is very often far more painful than whatever started it. There is a story, often told alongside this teaching, of an old fisherman who lived by a wide river at the edge of a small village. He had fished that river for so many years that the villagers had lost count, and he was known for a particular kind of patience, the sort that seemed less like a skill he'd practiced and more like something he had simply always had, the way some people are simply tall or simply quiet. A younger fisherman, newer to the trade and full of frustration at how often his own nets came up empty, once sat beside the old man on the riverbank and asked him how he managed to stay so calm day after day, even on the days when the fish would not bite at all. "Tell me," the old fisherman said, "what do you do on the days the fish don't come?" "I get angry," the young man admitted. "I curse the river. I wonder what I'm doing wrong. I sit there stewing about it the whole afternoon, and by evening I'm exhausted, and I still have no fish." The old man nodded slowly, as though this were a very familiar answer. "So on those days," he said, "you catch two things. First, no fish, and then, on top of that, a whole afternoon of anger, which you did catch, and which you now have to carry home with you as well." The young man frowned, turning this over. "I have had days with no fish too," the old man continued, "more of them than I could count across all these years. The river does not owe either of us anything, and it has never once apologized for an empty net. That is simply how a river is, some days more than others. But I have learned, slowly, and rather late in my life if I am honest, that the empty net is only the first arrow. It is the anger afterward, the cursing, the stewing, the asking why me, that is the second arrow, and it is one I choose to fire myself every single time I fire it. No one else pulls that bow but me." "So you never get frustrated?" the young man asked, somewhat doubtfully. The old man laughed at this, a short, warm sound. "Of course I do. I am not made of stone. A feeling of disappointment rises in me too, on an empty day, same as it rises in you. But I have found that if I let the disappointment simply be there, the way you'd let rain fall on you without deciding the rain was a personal insult, it passes through fairly quickly on its own. It is only when I chase after it, when I start arguing with the river or with myself about why the fish aren't biting, that the feeling stays around for hours instead of minutes. The chasing is what keeps it alive. The river was never holding on to it. I was. This teaching translates almost exactly onto the trouble of a mind that will not quiet at night. The first arrow is simply thinking, a memory, a worry, an unfinished thought looping back around for no clear reason. This is not a flaw in you. It is not evidence that you are somehow worse at resting than other people, or that something is broken in how your mind works. Thinking, even at 2 in the morning, even about things that have no business being thought about at 2 in the morning, is simply what a mind does. It is the river doing what rivers do. Some nights offering an easy, calm current, other nights running busier and rougher, for reasons that may have nothing to do with anything you did that day. The second arrow is what comes after. The frustration at yourself for still being awake. The fear that you'll be exhausted tomorrow. The old familiar spiral of why does this always happen to me? What is wrong with me? I should be asleep by now. None of this second arrow has anything to do with the original thought. It's a fresh wound, entirely self-made, fired the moment we decide that having a busy mind is itself a problem requiring urgent solving. And it is very often this second arrow, not the first, that keeps a person awake for hours rather than minutes. You may have noticed this yourself if you think back on your own nights of trouble sleeping. It is rarely the original worry that keeps you up so late. A bill to pay, a conversation to have, a task left unfinished. It is the worry about the worry, the frustration that you are still thinking about it, the dread that tomorrow will be ruined by tonight's lack of sleep, which itself becomes one more thought keeping you from sleep, which then becomes one more thing to feel frustrated about. On and on, arrow after arrow, each one fired by the last. The teaching does not ask you to stop the first arrow. You cannot most nights simply decide in advance that no thought will come, any more than the old fisherman could decide in advance that every day would bring a full net. Thoughts will arrive, worries will surface. This is simply what it is to have a mind, and no amount of practice makes a person immune to it entirely, not even after a lifetime of trying, not even the wisest teachers this tradition has ever known. What the teaching offers instead is much gentler and much more within reach. It asks only that you notice the moment the second arrow is about to be fired, the moment frustration begins to gather around the original thought, the moment you're about to say, "Why can't I just sleep?" And in that moment, simply set the bow down. Not because setting it down will make the first arrow disappear. It won't. The original thought may well still be there, drifting through your awareness like weather across a wide sky. But without the second arrow layered on top of it, without the anger and the fear and the self-criticism compounding the original moment, the first arrow tends to hurt far less and to pass far more quickly than it otherwise would. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes the entire shape of what you're being asked to do tonight. You are not being asked to stop your thoughts. You are only being asked to stop firing at yourself for having them. It might help, too, to notice how much of the second arrow is made of old habit, rather than present necessity. Most of us learned, somewhere along the way, that a busy mind at bedtime was a problem to be corrected quickly, an inconvenience to be scolded out of existence. No one meant harm by teaching us this. It simply became a reflex, the way flinching becomes a reflex after enough small surprises, until eventually the flinching happens even when nothing is actually threatening us at all. Tonight, you are welcome to set the old reflex down, gently, and see what it feels like to let a thought simply be a thought, without the scolding that usually follows so quickly and so automatically behind it, night after night, out of nothing more than old habit. You are allowed tonight to simply be a person with a mind that thinks, lying quietly in the dark, needing nothing further from yourself than that. Let us pause here and try this gently, together, with the breath. Take a slow breath in, and as you do, notice if there is any thought right now that you've been quietly frustrated with yourself for having, some worry, some stray fragment of the day, something you wish you weren't still thinking about. You don't need to push it away. Just notice it, the way you'd notice a boat drifting past on a river, without waving it down and without shouting after it to leave. Let the breath out slowly, and as you exhale, see if you can simply set down whatever frustration has gathered around that thought. Not the thought itself, only the second arrow, the extra one you've been the one holding all along. You may need to do this more than once tonight. That is completely normal. The old fisherman did not learn to let disappointment pass through him in a single afternoon. It took him, by his own account, most of a lifetime, and even then he admitted the feeling still rose in him from time to time, the way it rises in anyone with a beating heart. The aim was never to feel nothing. The aim was only to stop chasing the feeling once it arrived, to let the first arrow be the only arrow, and to trust that a single arrow, however sharp, always eventually stops hurting, once nothing more is added to the wound. There is a kindness available here that is easy to miss the first few times you try this, so it is worth naming plainly. Setting down the second arrow is not the same as pretending the first one doesn't hurt. It is not a demand that you feel calm when you don't, or peaceful when the day has left you anything but. The old fisherman did not pretend. An empty net felt like a full one. He simply refused to add a second injury to the first, and that refusal, small as it sounds, changed the whole shape of his evenings. You are allowed the same refusal tonight. You are allowed to feel whatever the first arrow brought, tiredness, worry, the particular ache of a mind that will not quite settle, without also deciding that feeling it means something has gone wrong with you. If you notice, as you lie here, that a second arrow has already been fired, that some frustration or self-criticism has crept in about the very fact that you're still awake, still listening, still working through this instead of already asleep, that is all right too. Even that can simply be noticed and set down gently, the way the fisherman set down his own irritation once he saw it clearly for what it was. There is no penalty for firing a second arrow. There is only the quiet option, available again in this very moment, to set the bow down now instead of later. Feel the weight of your own body once more, sink in a little further than it was a few minutes ago. Feel your breath moving on its own, in and out, without your needing to manage it. This breath does not require a second arrow either. It has been arriving and leaving for every minute of your life so far, entirely on its own, entirely without your supervision, and it will keep doing so tonight, whether your mind is quiet or busy, whether you notice it or not. Let us rest here for a while. There is no second arrow you are required to fire tonight, no frustration you are required to add to whatever is already quietly present in you. Just breathe and let the first arrow be enough, and let it pass through you the way an old fisherman lets an empty net be simply an empty net. Disappointing, perhaps, for a moment, but nothing more than that, and nothing lasting, unless you decide to make it so. Notice, if you can, the quiet difference between a feeling passing through you and a feeling you have picked up and started carrying. A feeling passing through asks nothing of you. It arrives, it is felt, it moves on, the way weather moves through an open sky. A feeling you carry is different. You have reached out and taken hold of it, slung it over your shoulder, agreed silently to keep it with you a while longer than it ever intended to stay. Tonight, see if you can simply let each feeling pass through, arrow and all, without reaching out to carry any of it further than it was already going on its own. When you are ready, we will move a little further into this same quiet territory and meet a different kind of teacher entirely. One who did not try to chase his thoughts away at all, but instead learned to welcome each one, almost like a guest arriving at the door, however unexpected or unwelcome that guest at first seemed to be. There was, it is said, an old innkeeper who lived at a crossroads far from any large city, in a house with a single guest room and a fire that never quite went out, even in the deepest part of winter. Travellers of every kind passed through that crossroads, merchants heavy with goods, pilgrims walking towards some distant shrine, tired soldiers returning from wars no one talked about anymore, thieves once or twice, though the innkeeper never seemed troubled by this, and ordinary families simply passing from one town to another. Whoever arrived at his door, at whatever hour, in whatever mood, the old innkeeper greeted them exactly the same way, with a bow, a warm bowl of something simple to eat, and a place by the fire. A young traveller who stayed there one night, unable to sleep for worry about the road ahead, asked the innkeeper how he managed it, greeting every stranger, every single one, with such steady, unhurried warmth, never once seeming to prefer one guest over another, never once turning anyone away for arriving in a foul temper or at an inconvenient hour. The old man considered the question for a while before answering, the way people do when a question has clearly been asked of them before by someone else on some other night. When I was younger, he said, I ran this in very differently. I judged each traveller as they arrived. I decided, often before they had even set down their bags, whether I liked them or not, whether they deserved my hospitality or only my patience, whether they would bring trouble into my house or simply pass through peacefully. I spent a great deal of energy on these judgments, and I noticed, after some years of this, that I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the actual work of running an inn. The work itself, the cooking, the cleaning, the tending of the fire, never tired me the way the judging did. So you stopped judging your guests? The young traveller asked. I stopped believing it was my job to decide who deserved to stay, the old man said. It occurred to me one evening, watching a particularly difficult guest storm off to bed in a temper, that he would be gone by morning regardless of what I thought of him. Every guest leaves eventually. That is, after all, the nature of an inn. No one stays forever, however much they might complain about the road, however comfortable the fire. So I began to think of each guest not as someone I needed to approve of, but simply as someone passing through, deserving of a warm meal and a place by the fire for exactly as long as they were here, and not one moment longer than that. The young traveller thought about this for a while, watching the innkeeper's own fire crackle low in its hearth. But what about the difficult guests, he asked. The ones who arrive angry or frightened or full of some trouble you didn't ask to hear about. Especially those, the old man said, with something almost like fondness in his voice. A guest who arrives afraid needs the fire and the meal more than a guest who arrives calm and easy. I do not ask a frightened traveller to be less afraid before I'll let him in. I do not ask an angry one to soften his temper at the door. I simply open the door, because that is what the door is for, and I let each guest be exactly as they are for as long as they are here, trusting, because I've seen it happen night after night, for more years now than I can easily count, that they will leave again in their own time, the way every guest always does. This story is often told alongside a very old and simple piece of Buddhist and Zen guidance about the thoughts and feelings that pass through a mind, especially at night, when there is little else to occupy the attention and every visitor seems to arrive at once. The teaching suggests that we treat each thought, each feeling, each worry or memory or stray fragment of the day, the way the old innkeeper treated his travellers, not as something to be judged, approved, argued with, or thrown back out into the cold, but simply as a guest, arriving for a while, deserving of a warm welcome for exactly as long as it stays, and trusted to leave again on its own, the way guests always eventually do. This is, admittedly, a difficult kind of welcome to offer some nights. It is one thing to open the door for a pleasant guest, a happy memory, a small satisfaction from the day, a simple physical comfort like the weight of a blanket settling over tired legs. It is quite another thing to open the door for the guests we would rather not host at all. A sharp worry about tomorrow, an old regret that resurfaces without warning, a fear that seems, in the dark, larger and more permanent than it ever does in daylight. Our instinct, with guests like these, is almost always to slam the door, to refuse them entry, to insist loudly that they have come to the wrong house and should try somewhere else. But here is the difficulty with slamming the door on a guest who has already arrived. They do not actually leave. They simply stand outside knocking, sometimes for hours, sometimes louder and more insistently than they would have if you had simply let them in the first place. A thought that is refused entry rarely disappears. It waits. It knocks again. It finds another way in, through a window instead of the door, arriving in some slightly different shape but carrying the same essential worry, the same essential fear, until eventually, exhausted by the effort of guarding every entrance to your own mind all night long, you let it in anyway, later and more reluctantly than you would have if you had simply opened the door the first time it knocked. There is something almost paradoxical in this, though the tradition has always understood it clearly. Resistance is what keeps a difficult thought lingering. Welcome, genuine, unjudging welcome, is what allows it to finish its stay and leave. This does not mean pretending to enjoy a difficult thought's company, any more than the old innkeeper pretended to enjoy the temper of an angry traveller. It only means not fighting at the door, not spending the whole night standing guard against a guest who was always going to arrive eventually, on some night or another, the way every kind of weather eventually arrives at every kind of house. Consider for a moment how this might look in practice. On an ordinary restless night like tonight, a worry arrives, something about tomorrow, some task left unfinished, some conversation that didn't go quite the way you wanted it to. The old habit is to greet this guest with immediate suspicion. I don't want you here, go away. Why do you keep coming back? This is the version of hospitality that exhausts an innkeeper night after night, judging every arrival, defending every door. The gentler alternative. And it is genuinely gentler, not simply a different kind of effort dressed up in softer language, is to notice the worry arriving, and instead of slamming the door, to simply let it in, the way you'd let in any traveller on a cold night, without deciding in advance whether you approve of it. You do not need to feed this guest a large meal. You do not need to invite it to stay in the good room by the fire for the rest of the evening. You only need to stop guarding the door against it, to let it sit for a while in its own quiet corner, trusting, as the old innkeeper trusted, guest after guest, year after year, that it will leave again on its own, in its own time, the way every guest eventually does, without your needing to force it out at all. You may find, if you try this tonight, that a worry welcomed in this quiet, unjudging way tends to stay for far less time than a worry you've spent the whole evening trying to keep locked outside. This is not a trick, and it does not work by magic. It works because a guest who is fought at the door has every reason to keep knocking, and a guest who is simply let in, fed, and allowed to sit quietly by the fire for a while has, eventually, nothing left to prove, and no reason to linger past its welcome. So if there is a thought sitting with you right now, uninvited, perhaps unwelcome, perhaps one you have already tried to push back out into the cold once or twice tonight, see if you can simply open the door instead. Not because you owe it anything, and not because you are required to enjoy its company, only because it has already arrived, the way every guest eventually arrives at every house along every road, and the kindest, quietest, least exhausting thing you can do now is let it sit by the fire for as long as it needs to, trusting that it too, like every traveller before it, is only ever passing through. It may help too to notice that the old innkeeper was never actually in danger from any of his guests, however difficult they seemed on arrival. His house was not made less safe by an angry traveller's temper, or less warm by a frightened traveller's fear. He simply had a great deal of practice trusting that his own house, his own steady, unhurried self, would remain exactly as it was, firelit, door sound, roof holding, no matter who passed through it or how loudly they knocked. This is worth remembering on a night when a difficult thought arrives, feeling larger than it actually is, more dangerous than it actually is, as though its mere presence in your mind could somehow damage the house itself. It cannot. You are not the guest. You were never the guest. You are and have always been the house, steady, standing, capable of holding whatever comes through the door without being changed by it in any lasting way. Houses have weathered far louder storms than the one currently sitting by your fire tonight, and every one of them, when morning came, was still simply a house. Walls upright, roof intact, door ready to be opened again for whoever knocked next, fire still warm in the hearth, exactly as it was before the storm ever arrived. You are that same steady house tonight, whatever guest happens to be sitting by your fire right now, however long they choose to stay before finding their own way back out onto the road, into the dark, toward wherever it is guests go once their visit is finally, quietly finished. There is a second part to this story that is told less often, but which the old innkeeper apparently shared only with travellers who stayed more than one night, as if it were a teaching that needed to be earned through a little more trust first. He said that in his early years running the inn, before he had learned any of this, he used to lie awake after a difficult guest had finally gone to bed, replaying the encounter, wondering if he'd handled it correctly, wondering what the guest thought of him now, turning the whole evening over and over, long after the guests themselves were already asleep down the hall. It took him some years to notice the strange asymmetry in this. The guest, whoever they were, angry or frightened or simply exhausted from the road, was almost always sleeping soundly by the time the innkeeper was still awake worrying about them. The guest had let the evening go. Only the innkeeper was still holding it. I realized, he told that traveller, that I was the only one still standing at the door long after it needed guarding. The guest had already gone to their room, already fallen asleep, already, in their own mind, moved on to tomorrow. I was the one still up, replaying a conversation that, to them, was probably already finished and forgotten. This is often the way of it. We stand guard over doorways long after anyone has stopped knocking, simply out of habit, simply because standing guard has become such a familiar posture that we forget how to set it down. Perhaps this is true of you tonight as well, in some small way. Perhaps there is a thought you are still holding, still standing guard over, that has, in truth, already said everything it came to say. It knocked. You let it in, or you didn't. And either way, its business here may already be finished, even if some old habit of vigilance is keeping you at the door a while longer than necessary. See if you can notice this gently, without judgment. Not a failure on your part, only an old reflex, the same reflex the innkeeper carried for years before he finally noticed it and set it down. Let us rest here for a few breaths and let the door stay open, gently, without effort. There is no guest arriving tonight that requires you to stand watch at the threshold. Whatever's come to sit with you for a while, worry, memory, some stray unfinished thought, let it have its place by the fire. It does not need your permission to be here, and it does not need your resistance to eventually leave. Both were always going to happen on their own, in their own time, the way every guest, welcomed or fought, eventually finds their way back out onto the road. Feel your own breath moving now like the innkeeper's fire, steady, low, undemanding, warming whatever comes near it without asking any of its guests to change first. There is nothing you need to guard tonight. There is nowhere you need to stand watch. The door can simply stay open, and everything that needs to leave will leave in its own good time, exactly as it always has. When you are ready, we will walk a little further along this same quiet road and meet someone who did not need to welcome guests at all, because she had learned something even simpler still, how to watch without needing to hold on to anything that passed before her, the way a person might watch a river from its bank, content to let each ripple arrive and disappear without ever once reaching in to grasp at the water itself. There was a woman who lived for many years beside a wide, slow river, in a small house with a garden that ran right down to the water's edge. She had grown old there, and the villagers who knew her often remarked on a particular quality she had, a stillness that did not seem effortful, the way some people's stillness clearly cost them something, a visible strain held just beneath the surface. Hers seemed instead like something she had simply learned, the way a person learns to walk without thinking about each individual step. A young mother from the village, exhausted by the noise and worry of raising 3 small children, came to sit with her one afternoon by the river, hoping to learn whatever it was the old woman seemed to know. "How do you stay so calm?" the young mother asked. "My mind is never quiet. Even when the children are finally asleep, I lie awake turning over every small thing that happened that day, and every small thing that might happen tomorrow." The old woman gestured toward the river in front of them, its surface catching the late afternoon light, small ripples moving steadily downstream. "Watch the water for a while," she said, "and tell me what you see." The young mother watched. "I see the current moving. I see a few leaves caught in it, drifting past. There, a stick, turning slowly as it goes." "And are you troubled," the old woman asked, "by any of it? The leaves, the stick, the current itself?" "No," the young mother said, a little puzzled by the question. "It's just a river. It's not doing anything to me." "That is because you are watching it," the old woman said, "without reaching into it. You are letting the water be water, letting each leaf be a leaf, letting the current carry whatever it carries, without needing to catch anything or slow anything down, or ask the river to explain itself to you. This is the whole of what I have learned to do with my own mind, over what feels now like a very long life. I have learned to watch it the way I watch this river, noticing what passes without reaching in." The young mother frowned slightly. "But surely you must reach in sometimes. Surely some thoughts need to be caught, examined, dealt with." "Some do," the old woman agreed. "A river is not without its uses beyond watching. I have drawn water from it every day for 50 years, and it has fed my garden and carried boats and done every practical thing a river is meant to do. But there is a difference between reaching in when there is a real reason to reach in, and reaching in constantly, out of habit, simply because a thought has floated past, and some old reflex insists it must be caught and turned over before it's allowed to continue on its way. Most of what floats past the mind in a single day, or a single restless night, needs nothing at all from us except to be let go on down the river. It was never asking to be caught." The young mother sat with this for a while, watching the water continue its steady movement past them. More leaves drifting by, a single bird skimming low across the surface before rising away again. "How do you know," she asked eventually, "which thoughts are the ones that actually need catching, and which ones are only meant to pass?" The old woman considered this carefully before answering. "In my experience, the ones that truly need catching tend to return calmly more than once, without any urgency attached to them. A genuine matter that needs deciding, a real task that needs doing. Those you can reach for gently when you are ready, in the daylight, with a clear head. But the ones that arrive at night, in a rush, dressed up in fear or shame or frantic urgency, insisting they must be solved this instant or some disaster will follow. Those, I have found, are almost never the ones that actually need catching. They are only the current doing what currents do, moving quickly, stirring up whatever loose thing happens to be nearby, and they settle again on their own if you simply let them pass, rather than diving in after them. This distinction is one the Buddhist tradition has explored under many different names across many centuries, though it is often gathered under the word mindfulness, a word that has come to mean a great many things in recent years, some of them quite far from its original sense, but which at its root points to something very close to what the old woman was describing. The practice of watching what arises in the mind with clear, steady attention, without needing to grasp at it, argue with it, or chase it away. Simply watching, letting the river be a river. This is different, it's worth saying clearly, from suppression, from the old habit of shoving a thought down and refusing to look at it at all. The old woman was not asking the young mother to ignore the river or to pretend it wasn't there. She was asking her to watch it fully, with real attention, and simply resist the urge to leap in after every leaf that floated past. There is a kind of watching that requires no swimming at all, only presence, only the willingness to notice something clearly without needing to change or control or possess it. Grasping, in this teaching, is often described as the true source of a restless mind, more than the thoughts themselves. It is not the leaf floating past that causes trouble. It is the hand that reaches out again and again, trying to catch each one, trying to hold the current still, trying to make the river behave in some way other than how a river naturally behaves. The exhaustion the young mother described, lying awake, turning over every worry from the day and every worry still to come, was not, the old woman gently suggested, caused by having thoughts. It was caused by the reaching, by the hand going into the water over and over all night long, refusing to simply watch. But it feels important, the young mother said. It feels like if I don't turn each thing over carefully enough, I'll miss something. I'll fail to prepare for something. I'll let my children down somehow by not thinking hard enough about every possible thing that could go wrong. The old woman nodded, as though this too were a very familiar thing to hear. I understand that feeling well. I raised children of my own on this very riverbank, and there were many nights I lay awake convinced that vigilance was the same thing as love, that if I simply worried hard enough, carefully enough, thoroughly enough, I could keep every bad thing from ever reaching them. It took me a long time to notice that the worrying itself never once prevented anything. It only cost me my sleep and some of my peace during the daylight hours as well, without ever once making my children any safer than they already were. The real caring, I found eventually, happened in the actual daylight hours, in the meals I made, the questions I asked them, the attention I gave while they were actually in front of me. The nighttime worrying was never really protecting anyone. It only felt in the moment like it must be doing something, because it was so effortful, and effort so often disguises itself as usefulness. The young mother looked back at the river, watching a new set of leaves drift into view and pass steadily out of sight downstream, carried along by a current that asked nothing of her at all. So tonight, the old woman said gently, if you find yourself lying awake again, turning over the small worries of the day and the larger uncertainties of tomorrow, see if you can simply watch them the way we are watching this river right now. Notice each one as it arrives. Let it be exactly the shape it is, whatever shape that happens to be, and then let it continue on, downstream, out of view, without your hand ever needing to enter the water at all. This is the practice the tradition calls watching without grasping, and it is, in its own quiet way, one of the gentlest and most immediately useful teachings available to anyone whose mind will not settle at night. You do not need years of practice to begin it, though like most things, it becomes easier with familiarity. You only need to notice The next time a thought arrives, worried, urgent, insistent that it must be solved this instant, that you have a choice available in that moment, a choice the old woman had clearly made many years before, sitting on the same riverbank, watching the same water. You can reach in and try to catch it and hold it and turn it over long into the night, or you can simply watch it pass, trusting, as she had learned to trust, that the current knows where it's going and that your hand was never actually required to guide it there. There is one more part of this practice worth mentioning, something the old woman only added when the young mother rose to leave that afternoon, almost as an afterthought, though it turned out to be one of the more important things she said. "You will not always succeed at simply watching," she said. "Some nights the hand goes into the water anyway, out of old habit, and you find yourself gripping some thought or worry tightly before you've even noticed you've reached for it. When this happens, do not scold yourself for reaching. Simply notice that your hand is in the water and open it. That is all. You do not need to have never reached in the first place. You only need to notice, at whatever point you notice, and open your hand again. This small addition matters more than it might seem, because most people, in their first attempts at watching a busy mind without grasping, expect themselves to succeed perfectly and immediately, and feel a fresh wave of frustration when they inevitably find themselves gripping some thought tightly a few minutes later, turning it over, arguing with it, doing exactly the thing they'd just been told not to do. This frustration, if left unchecked, becomes its own kind of grasping, a tight grip on the idea that you should already be better at letting go than you currently are. The old woman's teaching cuts through this neatly. The moment of noticing your hand is in the water is not a failure. It is, in fact, the entire practice. There was never a version of this where the hand stays perfectly out of the water all night. There is only ever the noticing and the gentle opening over and over as many times as it takes, for as long as the night requires it. Picture the river again, if it helps, wide, unhurried, carrying whatever the current happens to be carrying tonight. Picture your own hand resting on the bank beside it, open, empty, unclenched. If you notice at some point that your fingers have curled around some thought, without your quite meaning them to, simply uncurl them again, slowly, without any urgency or self-criticism, and let whatever you were holding continue on its way downstream. It was never going to stay in your grip forever regardless. It only ever needed you to notice and to open your hand and to let the current do what currents have always known how to do. Let your shoulders soften a little further now, and let your hands, wherever they are resting, stay open rather than closed. There is nothing tonight that needs to be gripped in order to be understood. There is nothing that needs your fingers wrapped tightly around it to prove that you have noticed it, cared about it, taken it seriously enough. The river takes every one of your thoughts just as seriously simply by carrying them onward, without ever once needing to be told to slow down or explain itself first. It has always known exactly where the water is going, even when you couldn't quite see it from the bank, and it has never once asked your permission before continuing on its way downstream toward wherever a river eventually goes. Notice too, if you can, the quiet sound of your own breath moving in and out, as steady in its own way as any river. You do not need to direct this breath any more than the old woman needed to direct her river. It knows its own course. It has been finding its way in and out for every single moment of your life so far, without your ever once needing to reach in and grasp at it to keep it moving correctly. Let it continue now, exactly as it wishes, while every thought passing near it is simply allowed to drift on by, unheld, unhurried, carried along by a current far older and far steadier than any single worry could ever be. A current that was moving long before tonight began and will keep moving long after you finally drifted off, patient and unbothered, exactly as rivers have always been, exactly as this one will still be tomorrow, and the day after, and every quiet evening after that, long after tonight's small worries have already reached the sea, quietly, without fanfare, and been folded gently, quietly, without a single ripple of protest, into something far too wide, far too old, and far too deeply, endlessly, quietly patient to ever fully notice them ever any more at all. Let us rest here for a few slow breaths and practice this together gently. If a thought is present with you right now, do not reach for it. Simply notice it, the way you'd notice a leaf catching the last light of afternoon on a river's surface, there and then gone, without your needing to do anything at all except watch. Let your hands stay still, resting wherever they are resting right now, heavy and unoccupied. There is no leaf tonight that requires catching. There is no current that requires your guidance to find its way onward. When you are ready, we will continue further along this same quiet river and turn our attention to a different kind of restlessness entirely. Not the racing thoughts of night itself, but the particular weight so many of us carry to bed with us of a day that never quite felt finished, and what it might mean to finally, gently, set that weight down. There is a particular kind of restlessness that has little to do with fear or worry in the usual sense, and much more to do with a simple, nagging sense of things left undone. It often arrives quietly, almost politely, compared to the louder anxieties that can crowd a mind at night. But it can be just as stubborn, just as good at keeping a tired body from finally letting go into sleep. It is the feeling of a day that never quite finished, a list not fully completed, a string of small tasks that seem to trail off the edge of today and into tomorrow, unwilling to let you rest until they are accounted for. There is an old story, told in farming villages across many generations, of a farmer who worked a modest plot of land at the edge of a forest, and who, every evening, found himself unable to sleep for thinking about everything still left to do. The fence needed mending in one corner. The far field hadn't been properly turned. A tool had broken that morning and he hadn't yet had time to repair it. Each night, lying in bed, he ran through this list again and again, as though the running through itself were a kind of work, a way of making progress, even while lying still in the dark. One evening, an old traveller passing through the region asked to stay the night, and the farmer, as was the custom, offered him a simple meal and a place to sleep. Over dinner, the traveller noticed the farmer glancing again and again toward the window, toward the fields outside, distracted even as they ate. "You seem troubled," the traveller said. "Is something wrong with the harvest?" "No," the farmer admitted. "The harvest is fine. It's only that there is always more to do than I manage to finish in a single day. Every night I go to bed with half of it still undone, and every night I lie there thinking about it, unable to rest until I've gone over the whole list at least once, sometimes several times. The traveller considered this for a while. "Tell me," he said, "when you finish your work in the field for the day, when the sun sets and you finally set down your tools, do you carry your plough into the house with you, your hoe, the seed you haven't yet planted?" The farmer looked at him, confused by the question. "Of course not. I leave the tools in the shed. There's no use bringing a plough indoors." "And why is that?" "Because," the farmer said slowly, working it out even as he spoke, "the work will still be there in the morning. The tools will be exactly where I left them. There's no need to carry them to bed with me. They'll wait." "Then why," the traveller asked gently, "do you carry the unfinished tasks themselves to bed with you every night, when you have already learned so easily to leave the tools behind?" The farmer sat with this question for a long moment, turning it over the way he might have turned over a stone in one of his own fields, checking its underside for something he'd missed. "I suppose," he said eventually, "I have never thought of the tasks as something separate from myself, the way I think of the tools as separate. The plough is just a plough, but the unfinished fence, the field still needing to be turned, those feel like they belong to me somehow, like I am somehow failing by having left them undone, and the failing follows me to bed even when the actual fence does not." The traveller nodded, as though this were exactly the answer he'd expected, and exactly the confusion he had hoped to help unwind. "The fence will still be broken in the morning whether you think about it all night or not," he said. "Your thinking about it tonight will not mend a single post. It will only cost you the rest you need to mend it well tomorrow. The tools go in the shed because the shed is where tools belong at the end of the day. Perhaps the unfinished tasks belong there too, at least until morning. Set down, left exactly where they are, trusted to wait for you the way the plough waits, patient and unbothered, for as long as it takes you to return to it." "But what if I forget something important?" the farmer asked, "by setting it down instead of holding it in my mind all night?" "Have you ever forgotten to mend a fence?" the traveller asked, "simply because you slept well the night before you mended it?" The farmer considered this and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he could not think of a single instance. The fence always got mended eventually, sleep or no sleep. The field always got turned. The tool always got repaired. Not one of these tasks had ever actually been lost by being set down for the night. They had only ever been delayed by a few hours at most, and often, he had to admit, his work the following day was better, not worse, on the nights he had actually managed to sleep well, than on the nights he'd spent turning the list over and over in his mind until dawn. This teaching, gentle and practical as it sounds, touches on something the Buddhist tradition takes quite seriously: the difference between genuine responsibility and a kind of anxious clinging that only dresses itself up as responsibility. Real care for your work, your family, your obligations does not actually require you to hold every unfinished task in your mind every waking and waking adjacent moment of the day. It requires you to do the work when it is time to do the work, and to rest when it is time to rest, trusting, the way the farmer eventually learned to trust, that the tasks left in the shed overnight will still be there, unchanged, exactly as capable of being finished tomorrow as they would have been if you'd exhausted yourself thinking about them all night instead. There is a kind of quiet grasping in the habit of carrying an unfinished day to bed, the same grasping the old woman by the river spoke of reaching into the current after every passing leaf. The mind, in this state, is trying to hold on to the day even as the day is trying to end, trying to squeeze a little more use out of hours that have already closed, as though vigilance itself were a kind of productivity, as though worrying about the fence were somehow equivalent to actually mending it. It rarely is. Worry, turned over enough times, begins to feel like work because it is effortful and tiring in a way that mimics real labor. But it produces nothing. The fence remains exactly as broken at midnight as it was at dusk, no matter how many times the mind walks past it in the dark, and the only real result of all that walking is a farmer or a listener, more tired the next morning than the actual work would have made him. Tonight, if there is a list running through your own mind, tasks left undone, conversations left unfinished, some version of a fence still waiting to be mended tomorrow, see if you can set it down the way the farmer learned to set down his tools, not by forgetting it entirely, and not by pretending it doesn't matter, only by trusting that it will still be there in the morning, patient and unchanged, exactly where you left it, capable of being tended to with a clear and rested mind, rather than an exhausted one. The list does not need your company all night to survive until morning. It has never once needed that from you, however convincingly the habit insists otherwise. Picture, if it helps, an actual shed. Wooden, simple, its door swinging gently in some quiet evening breeze. Picture yourself walking each unfinished task there, one at a time, setting each one down carefully on a shelf or against a wall, the way you might set down a tool at the end of a long day of real physical work. The fence goes there. The unanswered message goes there. The worry about tomorrow's schedule goes there too, however insistently it protests that it deserves to stay with you a while longer. Close the door gently behind you as you leave. It does not need to be locked. It only needs to be closed for tonight, so that the tools inside can rest exactly as much as you are about to rest, and be ready, exactly as you will be ready, when morning finally comes, and it's time to pick them up again. There is something else worth noticing about the farmer's story, something that becomes clearer the more you sit with it. The tools he set down each evening were never actually idle while they waited in the shed. They were simply waiting, which is a very different thing from being neglected. A plough left overnight is not a plough that has failed at its purpose. It is a plough between uses, exactly as it should be, exactly as capable tomorrow of turning soil as it was the evening before. The same is true of the unfinished parts of your own day. A task set down for the night is not abandoned. It is only paused, held safely in a kind of quiet suspension, waiting for hands that are rested enough to take it up properly again. It is worth asking gently what it is you actually believe will happen if you stop thinking about an unfinished task for a few hours. Most of the time, if you look honestly, the answer is nothing. The fence does not unmend itself further in the night. The unanswered message does not become more unanswered by your not thinking about it while you sleep. The only thing that reliably happens when a task is carried to bed instead of left in the shed is that the person carrying it sleeps less and wakes more tired, and often does the work less well the next day than they would have with a full night's rest behind them. The vigilance rarely protects the task, It only taxes the one doing the guarding. There is a kind of trust required here, the same trust the farmer eventually extended to his own fields. Trust that the world will still be standing in the morning. Trust that a night's sleep does not undo a day's honest effort. Trust that you are allowed to stop working before every single task is finished, because no day, in truth, ever really finishes that way. There will always be one more thing. There has always been one more thing every evening for every person who has ever tried to work their way to a completely empty list before allowing themselves to rest. The list was never going to run out. Rest was never meant to wait for it to. Consider how strange it would seem, put plainly, to insist that no farmer may ever sleep until every field is turned, every fence mended, every tool sharpened and put away in perfect order. No farmer has ever lived under such a rule, because no farm has ever actually worked that way. The work simply continues, season after season, and rest is woven through it, not scheduled for some far-off point after everything is finally completely done. Your own days are no different, however much the habit of the mind insists otherwise at 11 at night, cataloguing everything still undone, as though sleep were a reward to be earned only after the list reaches zero. The list reaching zero was never actually the condition for rest. It only felt that way, because the mind, tired enough, will believe almost anything that sounds urgent, however untrue it turns out to be, once examined calmly in the light of morning. Fence still standing, field still waiting, nothing lost by the simple, ordinary act of having slept. Everything exactly as ready for you as it always would have been, whether you'd stayed up worrying over it or not, whether you count that as proof enough tonight to finally let the shed door close softly behind you and walk the rest of the way home, unhurried, in the dark, toward whatever quiet rest has already, patiently, been waiting there for you all along, unhurried, quiet, and undisturbed. So let the shed door close now, gently, on whatever you carried there tonight. You do not need to check that everything is arranged perfectly inside before you leave. You do not need to promise yourself you'll remember every item on the list by morning. The shed will still be standing. The tools will still be exactly where you set them down. And you, unburdened for these next few hours at least, are free to walk back toward the house, toward the bed waiting for you, carrying nothing heavier than your own tired, honest body. The farmer, it is said, slept more soundly after that traveller's visit than he had in years, and when he woke the next morning, the fence was still broken, exactly as he'd left it, waiting patiently in the early light for hands that were, for the first time in a long while, actually rested enough to mend it well. He mended it before midday, the story goes, in less time than it usually took him, and he found himself wondering, as he worked, how many other evenings he had spent lying awake for nothing at all, guarding a fence that had never once needed his sleepless company to still be there waiting for him in the morning. Let us rest here for a while. There is no fence tonight that requires mending in the dark, no list that grows more finished by being turned over one more time before sleep. Let your hands, which have carried enough for one day, finally rest empty at your sides. Let your mind, which has held enough for one day, set its own tools down in that same quiet shed, trusting the door will still be there tomorrow, exactly as it always is, ready to be opened again whenever you are ready to walk back through it. When you are ready, we will turn towards something even simpler than any story so far. not a teaching to understand, not a parable to carry with you, but a single old and steady companion that has been with you this entire evening already, waiting quietly in the background of everything we've discussed. Your own breath and the very old practice of finally, fully coming home to it. There is one companion that has been with you this entire evening already, present through every story so far, though we have not yet turned to look at it directly. It has been here since the moment you first lay down tonight, and it will still be here tomorrow morning, and it asks nothing of you to keep working through every minute in between. It is, of course, your own breath, the oldest and most reliable teacher any tradition has ever offered, because unlike every parable and every teaching, it does not need to be remembered or understood. It only needs to be noticed. There is a story told of a boatman who spent his whole life ferrying passengers across a wide river, back and forth from one bank to the other, more times than he could ever count. Late in his life, a young student came to him, having heard that the old boatman possessed a kind of calm that even seasoned monks admired, and asked him the secret of it. "I have no secret," the boatman said. "I only follow my boat." The student, confused, asked him to explain further. "When I first began this work," the boatman said, "I used to watch the far bank the entire crossing, worrying about the current, worrying about the wind, worrying about whether I would arrive exactly where I intended to. I steered constantly, correcting and recorrecting, exhausting myself over crossings that, in truth, were rarely more than a few minutes long. One day, an old ferryman who trained me told me something I did not understand at the time. He said, 'Stop watching the far bank, watch your boat. Feel where it wants to go, and follow it there, gently, correcting only when truly needed, trusting the water to carry you the rest of the way.'" "And this worked?" the student asked. "It took years before I understood what he meant," the boatman admitted. "But eventually, yes, I stopped fighting the river and started following my own small boat instead, letting it rise and fall with the current, trusting it the way you trust a friend who has crossed this water many times before. And I noticed something curious. The less I fought, the smoother the crossing became. Not because the river changed. The river was always doing exactly what rivers do. Only I had changed in how tightly I gripped the oars." The student sat with this for a while, watching the old boatman's hands resting loosely on his knees, no oar in sight at that moment, entirely at ease. "What does this have to do with a restless mind?" the student asked. "Everything," the boatman said. "Your breath is your boat. It has been carrying you across every single day and night of your life, rising and falling with a current far steadier than any river's, and it needs no steering at all from you to keep doing its work. When your mind is far away, worrying about the distant bank, tomorrow, yesterday, some conversation that hasn't happened yet, you have stopped watching your own small boat, and you have started fighting a bank that isn't even close enough yet to concern you. Come back to the boat. Feel the breath rise. Feel it fall. Follow it, the way I finally learned to follow mine, and let the crossing take care of itself." This teaching, return to the breath, is perhaps the single most widely shared piece of guidance in the entire Buddhist tradition, offered by more teachers in more forms across more centuries than any other single practice. It is simple to describe and at the same time endlessly deep to actually live, which is part of why it has endured so long. The breath asks nothing complicated of you. It does not require you to understand any teaching, remember any parable, or master any technique. It only requires your attention, gently placed, again and again, each time it wanders, on something that has never once stopped moving since the moment you were born. You may have noticed, across this whole evening, how often the breath has quietly appeared in the background of every teaching so far, in the resting pauses between stories, in the small guided passages weaving through each chapter. This was never accidental. The breath is the thread that runs beneath every single one of these teachings, the boat every story has secretly been asking you to return to again and again, however far your attention wandered toward the far bank of some worry or memory in between. Here is something worth understanding clearly about this practice, because it is often misunderstood in a way that makes it feel like one more task to perform correctly. Following the breath does not mean controlling it. The boatman did not tell the student to force the boat in a particular direction, to hold his breath a certain length, to count each inhale and exhale as though grading himself on the precision of it. He said, "Follow." The breath already knows exactly what it is doing. It has been rising and falling without your conscious help through every moment of unconsciousness you have ever experienced, through every dream, through every deep and dreamless stretch of sleep you have ever had, through moments of your life you don't even remember living. It does not need you to manage it. It only needs sometimes a little bit of your attention so that your mind has somewhere quiet and steady to rest instead of drifting towards some distant, imagined shore. If your mind wanders while you follow the breath tonight, and it will, almost certainly, more than once, this is not a failure of the practice. It is, in fact, the practice itself. The boatman did not describe a single perfect crossing where his attention never once drifted toward the far bank. He described years of noticing when it had drifted, and gently, without frustration, bringing it back to the boat. The returning is the whole of it, not the staying, which no one manages perfectly, not even the wisest teacher this tradition has ever produced. Only the returning over and over, patient each time, as many times as the night requires. Let us practice this together now, slowly. There is nothing to get right here, only something to notice. Feel the next breath as it begins to rise, not forcing it deeper or slower than it wants to go, only feeling it, the way the boatman felt his own small boat lifting gently with the current. Notice the brief pause at the top of the breath, where it seems to rest for the smallest moment before beginning its return, and follow it back down, all the way down, without hurrying it, the way a boat settles gently back toward stillness after a small rise. If a thought pulls your attention away, and it likely will, since this is simply what minds do, notice, without any judgment at all, that you have drifted toward the far bank again, and gently, unhurriedly, bring your attention back to the boat, back to the breath, back to this single rise and this single fall, happening right now, in this very moment, needing nothing further from you than your quiet company. There is no far bank you need to reach tonight. There is no destination this crossing requires you to arrive at before you're allowed to rest. There is only the boat, rising and falling, carrying you gently across whatever stretch of dark water lies between this moment and sleep, exactly as it has carried you across every night that came before this one, and exactly as it will carry you across every night still to come. There is a second part to the boatman's story, told less often, but perhaps just as useful, about a particular crossing he remembered more clearly than almost any other in his long career. It was a night crossing, he said, made during a sudden storm that had blown in without warning, the water rougher than he had seen it in years, the far bank invisible entirely behind a curtain of driving rain. He had 2 passengers that night, both of them terrified, both of them shouting instructions at him. Steer left, no, steer right, hurry, we're going to capsize. As though their fear could somehow help guide the boat more safely across. I remember, the boatman said, wanting very badly to listen to them. Their fear was so loud and so insistent that some part of me wanted to grab the oars even tighter, to fight the water even harder, to prove to them and to myself that I was doing everything possible to get us across safely. But I had crossed this river many hundreds of times by then, in every kind of weather, and something in me, some part deeper than the fear, deeper than the shouting, remembered the old ferryman's advice. Watch your boat, not the storm, not the passenger's fear, however understandable it was, the boat. So I did, he continued. I stopped listening to the shouting, gently, without arguing with it, and I put my attention back on the small, immediate motion of my own boat, rising and falling with each wave, exactly as it always had. I made small corrections, the same small corrections I always made, no more urgent than usual, no more forceful than usual, and we crossed. It took longer than a calm night would have, and it was not comfortable, but we crossed, the same way I had crossed 1,000 times before, because in the end a storm does not actually change what a boat needs from its boatman. It only changes how loudly everything around him is shouting for him to abandon what he already knows how to do. This part of the story matters for nights when the mind is not simply busy, but genuinely stormy, when worry arrives not as a gentle cloud, but as something that feels much closer to that terrified shouting on the boatman's crossing, insistent, urgent, certain that only frantic effort will see you safely through until morning. On nights like this, the instinct is almost always to grip harder, to think faster, to fight the racing mind with more force, matching its urgency with urgency of your own. But the boatman's crossing suggests something different. Even in the loudest storm, the boat still only ever needs the same small, steady attention it needed on the calmest night. The breath does not require a different kind of following when the mind is loud than when it is quiet. It only requires the same gentle return, offered as many times as the storm demands it, for as long as the crossing takes. You may find, on a night like this, that your attention drifts toward the breath and away from it many, many times in quick succession, far more than on an easier night. This is not evidence that the practice has failed you. It is only evidence that tonight's crossing happens to be a stormier one than most, and stormy crossings by their nature ask for more returning, not more force. The boatman did not steer harder in the storm. He simply returned to his oars again and again, with the same unhurried attention he always used, trusting that the boat itself already knew how to ride out rough water, the way it always had, the way boats generally do, given a steady hand and enough patience. Let your own breath rise now gently, without needing to be deeper or slower or more controlled than it naturally wants to be tonight. If your mind has been stormy this evening, Let this next breath be one small, steady correction, nothing more urgent than that, and the breath after it, another small correction, and the one after that. You do not need to reach the far bank all at once. You only need this single rise and this single fall happening now, exactly as it is, exactly enough for this one small moment of crossing. The boatman, when he finally reached that far shore during the storm, said he felt no great triumph, no dramatic sense of having conquered anything. He simply tied off the boat, helped his shaking passengers onto solid ground, and felt, more than anything, a quiet tiredness that had nothing frantic left in it at all. The storm had passed, the way storms do, and the boat and the boatman were still exactly what they had always been. Nothing about the crossing had required him to become someone braver or stronger than the person who had made 1,000 calmer crossings before it. It had only required him to keep returning to what he already knew, one small correction at a time, until the far bank was simply, quietly, there. Your own breath carries this same steady patience with it tonight, whatever kind of crossing this particular night turns out to be. It does not need you to be someone other than who you already are. It only needs your gentle, repeated return, exactly as many times as tonight happens to require. Feel it rising once more now, unhurried, needing nothing from you but your quiet company, and falling again, all the way down, settling, the way a boat settles once it has finally reached calmer water. There is nothing left to steer tonight except this. Nothing left to cross except this single, ordinary, endlessly repeating rise and fall, carrying you, as it always has, a little closer to rest, a little further from the far bank you no longer need to watch so closely tonight, a little nearer to the quiet shore where this whole evening has been gently, patiently leading you all along, one small, unhurried breath at a time. There is no need to count these breaths, or measure them, or judge whether this one was calmer than the last. Each breath only ever needs to be exactly what it already is, rising, pausing, falling, rising again. The same small, faithful motion that has carried you, without fail, through every night you have ever lived, including, quietly, this one. Let us rest here for a while and simply follow the breath together, without adding anything to it, without asking it to be anything other than exactly what it already is. In and out, in and out. There is nowhere else this crossing needs to go tonight, except wherever the current is already, patiently carrying you. When you are ready, we will turn to one final image before this evening begins to gather itself toward its close. The image of a cup and a very old lesson about what happens when we finally gently stop trying to fill ourselves with more and instead make room for what is already here. There is a well-known story in the Zen tradition, told for many generations, of a university professor who travelled a considerable distance to visit a Zen master named Nanin, hoping to learn about the nature of Zen practice. The professor arrived at the master's house with a great many questions and a great deal of confidence in his own understanding, having read widely on the subject before making the journey. Nanin received him warmly and, as was the custom, offered him tea. He poured his visitor's cup full and then kept pouring. The professor watched the cup overflow, tea spilling over the rim, running across the table, until at last he could not contain himself any longer. "The cup is full," he said. "No more will go in." "Like this cup?" Nanin said, setting down the pot. You are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup? This story is told so often in so many variations that it has become almost a kind of shorthand within the tradition for a very particular and very important teaching, that a mind already full of certainty, full of opinion, full of its own effortful striving to understand or to achieve or to arrive somewhere, has no room left for anything new to settle into it. It does not matter how sincerely the professor wanted to learn. His sincerity was not in question. What was in question was whether there was any space left in him for the teaching to actually land, given how completely he had already filled himself in advance with his own ideas about what the answer would be. This has a great deal to say, gently, to a mind that will not quiet at night. So often, the trouble is not that we lack the capacity for stillness. It is that we arrive at the end of the day already full of the day's conversations, full of tomorrow's plans, full of old worries poured in and never quite emptied out, full sometimes of our own effortful attempts to force ourselves into calm, which, as we discussed earlier this evening, is simply one more thing added to an already overflowing cup. There is no more room most nights, not because stillness has failed to arrive, but because the cup was never given the chance to be emptied first. Emptying, in this sense, does not mean forgetting everything, or pretending the day never happened, or pushing away every thought until the mind resembles some vacant, echoing room. That would only be another form of forcing, another version of the stirred water from earlier this evening, effort disguised as peace. Emptying, as the tradition describes it, is something gentler and much less effortful than that. It is simply the willingness to stop pouring more in, to let the cup sit exactly as full as it currently is, without adding a single new drop, and to trust that a cup left alone, like a jar of muddy water left alone, like a river left unfished by grasping hands, will, in its own quiet way, begin to settle. There is a smaller story, less often told, that is sometimes offered alongside this one, of a young student at Nanin's own monastery, who once asked him a slightly different question. If the mind must be empty to receive a teaching, the student asked, then surely one should try very hard to empty it as quickly as possible, so that real learning can finally begin. Nanin, it is said, only smiled at this. Trying hard to empty a cup, he said, is still a way of pouring something into it. This time, the effort itself, the trying, the hurrying. A cup empties itself best when it is simply tipped gently and allowed to pour out at its own pace, not scraped at frantically by an impatient hand that wants the emptying to happen faster than emptying actually happens. This is worth turning over slowly, because it touches on something that has run underneath every single teaching offered this evening, in one shape or another. The mud that settles fastest when the hand withdraws, the sky that was never troubled by any cloud passing through it, the boat that crosses most smoothly when the oars stop fighting the current. Emptying a busy mind at night works the very same way. It is not achieved by hurrying, and it is not achieved by force. It happens quietly on its own. The moment you stop pouring more in, and the moment you stop demanding that the emptying happen faster than it naturally wants to. Consider for a moment everything you poured into your own cup today, without perhaps even noticing you were doing it. Conversations, large and small. Decisions, some easy and some not. Information, messages, headlines, The countless small facts and impressions that arrive constantly across even an ordinary day, each one adding some small amount to the cup, until by evening it is fuller than you likely realized while it was happening. This is not a mistake on your part. It is simply what it is to move through a day awake and attentive in the world. But it does mean that by the time you lie down at night, the cup is often close to overflowing, and the mind, sensing this, keeps trying to process, sort, and make sense of everything that was poured in, hour after hour, well past the point where any of that sorting is actually useful. The gentlest thing you can do for this cup tonight is not to work harder at emptying it. It is to simply stop pouring and let it be exactly as full as it currently is, trusting. As Nanin trusted, as the boatman trusted his own small boat, as the old woman trusted her river, that a cup left undisturbed finds its own way towards space, the way water finds its own level, the way mud finds its own way to the bottom of a still jar. You do not need to sort through today's conversations one more time before sleep is allowed to come. You do not need to review tomorrow's plans once more, refining them further, as though one more pass through the list will finally make the cup light enough to rest. You have already poured what needed pouring today. The cup can simply sit now, undisturbed, on the table between you and whatever comes next, and it will empty itself slowly, the way every full cup eventually does, given enough quiet and enough time. There is something quite tender in this image, if you sit with it a while. The idea that rest does not require you to achieve emptiness through effort, but only to stop actively resisting it. The emptying was always going to happen on its own. It has happened every single night of your life so far, whether you noticed it happening or not, whether you helped it along with worry, or simply let it be. Tonight can be one more night like that. The cup does not need your management. It only needs your permission to finally, quietly, be still. There is another detail from the story of Nanin and the professor that is worth returning to. One that is often left out when the story is told quickly, but which changes the whole shape of the teaching once it's included. The professor, after watching his cup overflow, did not simply nod politely and accept the lesson. It is said that he sat with Nanin a good while longer that afternoon and asked, somewhat plaintively, how he was supposed to simply stop pouring when pouring, thinking, analyzing, forming opinions, was the very skill that had brought him so far in his own field, the very habit of mind that had made him a respected professor in the first place. Nanin is said to have answered him gently. I am not asking you to become a man who cannot think, he said. A cup is not a punishment to the water it holds. It is only asking tonight to be allowed to rest for a while, unfilled, so that it might be useful again tomorrow. You may return to your pouring in the morning and pour as skillfully as you like, but even the finest cup, poured into constantly, without pause, without ever once being emptied and rinsed and set down to dry, grows cloudy over time and stops holding its tea as cleanly as it once did. Rest is not the enemy of your thinking. It is what keeps your thinking clear enough to be worth doing at all. This distinction matters a great deal for anyone who has ever worried, late at night, that simply allowing the mind to rest amounts to some kind of neglect, of responsibilities, of problems still needing solved, of a self that has always measured its worth by how constantly and effectively it thinks. The old master's answer suggests something gentler and in the end more practical. A mind that rests fully at night is not a mind that has abandoned its work. It is a mind that will return to that work tomorrow clearer, steadier, and considerably more capable than a mind that never once allowed its cup to sit empty, even for a single night. Consider, too, how a cup actually empties once it is finally left alone. It does not happen instantly, the way water might have poured out all at once. It happens gradually, a slow evaporation, so gentle it can hardly be observed happening at all, so that if you check the cup only occasionally, you notice only that it has become emptier since the last time you looked, without ever having witnessed the exact moment the level changed. This is very often how a mind empties too, over the course of a long, quiet evening like this one. You will not likely notice the precise moment your own cup grew lighter. You will only notice, perhaps somewhere near the end of this evening, that it has in fact become lighter than it was when we began, not because you worked to empty it, but because you simply allowed it, finally, to be still. Let your body settle a little further now, sinking heavier into whatever is holding you. Let your hands rest empty, palms soft, nothing gripped, nothing held. There is no more pouring required of you tonight. The cup can simply sit quietly on the table of this long evening and grow lighter in its own time, at its own unhurried pace, exactly the way every cup, left alone long enough, eventually does. There is a particular kind of relief that tends to arrive somewhere around this point in a long, quiet evening like this one. Not a dramatic relief, nothing sudden or triumphant, but something closer to a slow loosening, the kind you might feel in your shoulders after finally setting down something heavy you'd been carrying for hours without quite noticing the weight of it. If you feel some version of this now, however small, let it be exactly what it is. You do not need to hold on to the feeling, examine it, or make sure it stays. Like everything else this evening, it is simply passing through. One more guest at the fire, one more leaf on the river, one more small breath rising and falling on its own. And if you do not feel this loosening yet, that is entirely all right as well. Some cups take longer to empty than others, and there is no schedule tonight that requires yours to finish emptying by any particular hour. The tea tradition Nanin belonged to has always understood patience as part of the practice itself, not a failure to reach it quickly enough. Whatever pace your own evening is moving at, it is the right pace, because it is the only pace actually available to you right now, and pushing against it would only be one more hand-stirring water that was already, quietly, finding its own way toward stillness. There is one last thing worth carrying from Nanin's small wooden room, something easy to miss beneath the more famous image of the overflowing cup. The professor, before he left that day, is said to have asked Nanin whether he ought to come back another time, once he had properly practiced emptying his cup, so that the real teaching might finally begin. Nanin only shook his head. "The cup you brought today was already enough," he said. "It was already exactly the cup you have. There is no more correct cup you must arrive with next time, only the willingness, whenever you come, to let this one, as it is, finally rest. You do not need a better mind than the one you brought to bed with you tonight. You do not need to have arrived here calmer or clearer or further along in this practice than you currently are. The cup you have right now, however full, however weary, however busy it has felt across this long evening, is already entirely enough. Nothing further needs pouring into it, and nothing further needs proving by it before you're finally allowed to set it down gently on the quiet table of this long evening and let it simply sit there undisturbed for as long as sitting there quietly is exactly what it needs tonight and for however many nights after this one it takes. A cup asks nothing of the table that holds it. It does not have to justify its own stillness or prove that it has earned a rest or explain to anyone why it has stopped pouring for the evening. It simply sits, and in the sitting, slowly, quietly, becomes lighter than it was. You are permitted this same unearned, unexplained stillness tonight, exactly as the cup is, exactly as it always has been, waiting quietly for you on this table all evening long. Let us rest here for a while, and let the cup sit exactly as full as it is right now, without adding a single new worry, a single new thought, a single new demand that it empty itself any faster than it naturally wants to. Feel your hands, wherever they are resting, entirely empty themselves. Nothing left to pour, nothing left to hold, nothing left to manage. There is only the quiet table, and the cup upon it, and the long, unhurried night ahead, doing exactly what nights have always known how to do. When you are ready, we will turn to one final story before this long evening begins its slow journey toward its close. A story about a garden and a gardener who learned, late in her life, that the wildest, most tangled parts of her garden were never actually a sign that something had gone wrong. There was an old gardener who tended the grounds of a small temple for the better part of 50 years, and whose garden, by the time she had grown old herself, had become something of a quiet local wonder, not because it was perfectly ordered, but because it wasn't. Vines wandered where they pleased along the low stone walls. Certain corners were left thick with wildflowers that no one had ever deliberately planted. A single overgrown patch of moss had been allowed to creep, uncorrected, across half of what had once been a gravel path, until walking through it felt less like entering a garden and more like stepping into a quiet green room that had simply grown up around you. A younger monk, newly arrived at the temple and eager to prove himself useful, once offered to help her bring the garden into better order, trimming what had grown wild, straightening what had wandered, restoring, as he put it, some proper discipline to the grounds. The old gardener listened to him patiently, then led him to the edge of the mossy path. "Tell me," she said, "what do you see wrong with this?" The young monk looked at the moss, spreading thick and uneven across what had once, judging by the edges still visible, been a neat gravel walkway. "It has overtaken the path," he said. "It should be cleared back, so the path is a path again." "And if I clear it back," the old woman said, "will it stay cleared?" The young monk considered this. "Not forever," he admitted. "Moss returns, if the conditions favour it. You would need to clear it again and again." "Yes," she said. "For 50 years, in fact, if my own experience is any guide, I did exactly what you're suggesting when I first arrived here, clearing back everything that grew where I hadn't planned for it to grow, pulling every uninvited vine, sweeping every patch of moss before it had a chance to spread. It was exhausting work, and it never once finished, because the garden was never actually fighting me. It was simply growing, the way gardens grow, and I was the one insisting it grow only in the specific places I had decided were correct." "So you simply let it do whatever it wants now?" the young monk asked, somewhat skeptically. gesturing at the wandering vines along the wall. "Not quite," the old gardener said. "I still tend this garden every day. I still water what needs water, and prune what genuinely needs pruning, and pull the occasional weed that threatens to choke something I care about. But I have learned, over many years, to tell the difference between tending and controlling. Tending asks, gently, what does this garden actually need to thrive? Controlling asks, how do I force this garden to match the picture I've already decided it should look like? The first is real work, and it is never finished, but it does not exhaust me. The second is a kind of war I fought for years against a garden that was never actually my enemy, and it left me tired in a way that had nothing to do with the actual labour of gardening." The young monk looked around at the wandering vines, the wildflowers, the thick green moss underfoot, seeing it now, perhaps for the first time, not as a garden that had gotten away from its keeper, but as one that had simply been allowed to become fully, quietly itself. "Your mind," the old gardener said, noticing where his attention had settled, "is not so different from this garden, and I suspect this is true of most minds, including my own on the nights it decides to be difficult. There will always be some part of it that wants to grow where you had not planned for it to grow. A worry creeping in along an edge you thought was settled, an old memory spreading, unbidden, like moss across a path you'd rather keep clear. You can spend your whole life fighting this, clearing and re-clearing the same patches over and over, exhausting yourself in a war against your own mind's natural tendency to grow in directions you did not choose. Or you can learn, slowly, the difference between real tending, the gentle care that keeps a mind healthy, and the exhausting, endless controlling that mistakes every unplanned thought for an enemy requiring immediate removal. This same idea appears, in a slightly different form, in one of the oldest and most quoted lines from the Dhammapada, a collection of the Buddha's sayings that has been treasured across the Buddhist world for well over 2,000 years. It says, in its plainest translation, that the untended mind brings suffering, the way an untended field brings only weeds. But it is worth being careful with this line, because it is often misread as an argument for constant, forceful control, as though the solution to a wandering mind was simply more discipline, more effort, more relentless clearing of every unwanted thought the moment it appears. The old gardener's teaching suggests a gentler reading, one closer perhaps to what was originally intended. An untended field is not one where the gardener has failed to fight every weed into submission. It is one where no care has been given at all, no water, no attention, no gentle presence checking in on what is actually needed. Tending does not mean warfare. It means presence. It means showing up day after day with quiet attention, noticing what genuinely needs care and offering it, while allowing the rest, the wandering vine, the patch of unplanned moss, the wildflower that arrived on its own, to simply be what it naturally is, without deciding in advance that all of it must be corrected. A mind that is tended in this gentler way, night after night, does not become perfectly ordered. It never will, any more than the old gardener's temple grounds ever became a perfectly straight gravel path from end to end. But it becomes, slowly, a place that is cared for rather than controlled. And there is a very great difference, felt in the body as much as in the mind, between a mind under constant siege and a mind that has simply been allowed, with quiet daily attention, to grow into whatever shape it was always going to grow into anyway. Tonight, if your own mind feels like an untended field, wild in places, overgrown with worry in a corner, you'd rather keep clear. See if you can offer it tending instead of warfare. Notice what is actually there gently, the way the old gardener noticed her moss, without immediately reaching for a broom. Offer your attention softly, the way you'd offer water to something thirsty. And let the rest, the wandering, the overgrowth, the parts that refuse to sit in neat, expected rows, simply be what they are for tonight, trusting, as the old gardener trusted after 50 patient years, that a garden cared for gently needs far less correcting than anyone ever expects. There was one more exchange between the old gardener and the young monk, which he apparently thought about for years afterward, long after he had grown into an old teacher himself. He had asked her, before leaving that afternoon, whether she ever worried that her gentler approach would eventually let the garden grow so wild that it stopped being a garden at all, that without enough control, the walls themselves might eventually disappear beneath vine and moss and wildflower, until nothing remained to distinguish the tended grounds from the forest just beyond them. The old gardener considered this seriously, as though it were not a foolish question at all, which the young monk had half expected her to think it was. I have wondered this myself some years, she admitted, but I have noticed, across 5 decades of watching this ground, that a garden tended with real attention, even gentle attention, even attention that allows a great deal of wildness, rarely loses itself entirely. The walls remain because I still care for the walls. The paths I still wish to walk remain walkable because I still walk them. And my presence alone keeps certain corners clear without my needing to fight for it. What I have given up is not care. I have only given up the belief that every single inch of this garden must look a particular way before I'm allowed to call it well tended. There is a great difference between a garden that has been abandoned and a garden that has simply been trusted to grow into more of itself than I originally planned for it to become. She gestured, as she said this, toward a corner where a stand of tall grass had been allowed to grow uncut for several seasons, now home, she mentioned, to a family of small birds that returned every spring to nest in it. I did not plan for this grass, she said. I did not plan for these birds. If I had insisted years ago on the garden I originally imagined when I first arrived here, none of this would exist. The garden would be smaller for it, not larger, not more disciplined, only smaller, only less alive than it has become by my simply learning, slowly, to let it surprise me. This is, perhaps, one of the gentlest permissions available in the whole of tonight's teaching, that a mind allowed some wildness, some unplanned growth, some corner it did not intend and cannot fully explain, is not a mind that has failed at rest. It may, in fact, be a mind that has finally stopped mistaking rigid control for peace and has begun to trust the way the old gardener trusted after 50 patient years, that what grows on its own, given gentle care rather than constant correction, is very often more alive and more genuinely restful than anything achieved by force ever could have been. Feel your own mind now, whatever shape it has taken this evening, exactly as it only quiet tending, only the gentle, patient trust of someone who has learned over many years, or perhaps only over this one long evening, that a garden, like a mind, like a breath, like a whole restless night finally beginning to settle, does its best growing exactly when it is allowed finally to simply be itself. It is worth remembering, too, that the old gardener did not arrive at this gentleness quickly. She spent years, by her own account, fighting her garden before she learned to tend it instead, and there is no reason to expect any of us should arrive at this same ease overnight, on a single evening, simply by hearing the story once. If your own mind still feels tonight like something you would rather correct than tend, like a garden with far too much moss and far too little order, that is not a failure of this teaching. It is only where you happen to be standing tonight, on one particular evening out of many still to come, each one another small chance to practice the same gentle noticing, the same quiet setting down of the shears. The moss will still be there tomorrow, if it needs to be there. And so, gently, unhurried, will you? There is a final image worth holding on to from this old gardener's 50 years of quiet work, one she offered almost as an aside near the end of that afternoon's conversation. She said that on the mornings she felt most tired, most reluctant to face the day's small tasks. She had learned to walk once, slowly, through the whole garden before doing anything else at all. Not to inspect it for problems, not to plan the day's corrections, but simply to look at it, the way you might look at an old friend first thing in the morning, before asking anything of them. Most mornings, she said, I find I need to do far less than I expected, once I have actually looked first, instead of assuming I already knew what needed fixing. This too is a kind of tending available to you tonight. Before deciding your mind needs correcting, before assuming every wandering thought is a weed requiring immediate attention, simply look first. Walk once, slowly, through whatever is growing in you right now. You may find, as the old gardener so often found, that far less needs fixing than the tired, wary part of you assumed on first waking to the thought of it. Look first. Walk once, slowly, through the whole of it, the way the old gardener walked her own grounds every quiet morning, asking nothing of what she found there except to be truly seen. Then decide gently, whatever there truly is left to decide, if anything at all remains once the looking is finally, unhurriedly done. And trust, as she trusted after 50 patient years of walking the same quiet ground, that most mornings, and most nights too, there turns out to be far less deciding required than the tired mind first assumed. Somewhere in this garden tonight, quietly, unnoticed until this very moment, something has already been growing exactly as it should. It did not need your permission to begin, and it does not need your correction to continue. It only needs, from you, what the old gardener eventually learned to give her own wild corners, after so many years of fighting them first. A little patience, a little trust, and the quiet, unhurried willingness to simply let it be, exactly as it is for tonight, and for as long after tonight as it happens to need, without your ever again needing to stand watch over it through yet one more long, weary, quite sleepless night. Let us rest here for a while, in whatever shape your own garden happens to be tonight. There is no path that must be perfectly clear before you're allowed to walk it. There is no corner of moss that must be swept away before rest is permitted to arrive. Only quiet tending, only gentle presence, only the simple, unhurried willingness to let what is growing continue to grow, exactly as it is, for as long as tonight requires. When you are ready, we will come, at last, to the final part of this evening together and gather everything we have walked through so far. The settling water, the passing clouds, the single arrow, the open door, the watching river, the waiting shed, the following breath, the emptying cup, and this quiet, wild garden, into one last image as we finally let the whole of the mind rest. It is said that the young monk from the very beginning of this evening, the one who came to his teacher so distressed, so certain that his racing mind meant something had gone deeply wrong with his practice, returned to that same small wooden hut many months later on another quiet afternoon, with the seasons having turned once or twice in between. The old teacher was sitting outside his door when the young monk arrived, mending a torn piece of cloth in the late light, unhurried as he always seemed to be. He looked up, recognized his old student, and gestured for him to sit. "How is your mind these days?" the teacher asked, after they had sat together in silence for a while, the way old friends often do before either feels any need to speak. The young monk considered the question carefully before answering, which was itself, perhaps, a small sign of how much had changed since his last visit. "It is still busy," he admitted, "some nights more than others. I do not think it has become the still, silent thing I once imagined a well-trained mind should be." "No," the teacher agreed, "it rarely does. Not for anyone, however many years they sit." "But something else has changed," the young monk continued. "I no longer fight it the way I used to. When a thought comes now, I try to remember the water in the jar, and I let it be, and it settles on its own, in its own time. When my thoughts feel large and troubling, I try to remember that I am the sky, not the weather, and that even the heaviest storm passes eventually. When I notice I am angry at myself for still being awake, I try to remember there was never any need to fire that second arrow in the first place. I do not always remember these things. Some nights I forget entirely and lie awake exhausted and frustrated, exactly as I did before I ever came to you. But more nights than not now, I remember at least one of them, and that has made all the difference." The old teacher smiled at this, the particular smile of someone who has heard this exact realization arrive in slightly different words from a great many students over a great many years, and who never once tires of hearing it again. "You expected, when you first came to me," the teacher said, "that I would teach you how to stop your mind entirely, how to become a person who simply does not think busy thoughts at night, the way some rock does not think at all, ever, about anything. That was never what I was teaching you, and I suspect you know that now, though perhaps you didn't when you first arrived." "What were you teaching me then?" the young monk asked. "Only this," the teacher said, setting down his needle and thread for a moment. "That you do not need to win a war against your own mind in order to rest. You only need to stop fighting long enough to let it settle on its own, the way it has always known how to do, the way every mind, in every tradition, in every corner of the world, across every single night since minds first began to think at all, has eventually found its way toward quiet, given enough patience and enough gentleness. This is not a technique you master once and then possess forever. It is a practice you return to again and again, on every restless night for the rest of your life, exactly as you have been returning to it these past months. And that returning, not some final permanent stillness, but the simple, humble willingness to return gently one more time is the whole of what I hoped you would learn. The young monk sat with this for a long while, watching the last of the afternoon light move across the hut's wooden floor, exactly as it had on his very first visit, though he himself, he realized, was not quite the same person who had sat here then. I still have nights, he said eventually, where none of it works, where the water stays muddy the whole night through, where the sky feels entirely lost behind cloud, where I fire arrow after arrow at myself until dawn. On those nights, I wonder if I have learned anything at all. Tell me, the teacher said, on those difficult nights, are you still the same person who is capable of forgetting the teaching entirely? Or are you, somewhere underneath the forgetting, still the one who remembers it exists, even if you cannot quite reach it that particular night? The young monk considered this. I suppose I am still that person. Even on the worst nights, some small part of me knows there is a gentler way to hold all of this, even if I cannot find my way to it in the moment. Then you have not lost anything, the teacher said. A difficult night does not undo the practice. It is simply a difficult night, the kind every person who has ever tried to rest a busy mind eventually meets again and again for as long as they live. The mud does not always settle quickly. Sometimes a jar is stirred especially hard by the events of a particular day, and it takes longer than usual to find its own stillness again. This is not failure. It is only water, behaving exactly as water behaves, under exactly the conditions it happens to be in that night. So what do I do? The young monk asked. On those especially difficult nights, when nothing seems to settle no matter how long I wait. The old teacher thought about this for a while before answering. In the unhurried way he answered most things. You do the same thing you would do on any other night, he said. You stop stirring as best you can. You return to the breath as best you can. You remind yourself, as gently as you're able, that you do not need to win this particular night in order for the practice to still be working. Some jars take until morning to clear, and that too is simply part of how water behaves sometimes. The teaching was never a promise that every single night would settle quickly and completely. It was only ever a promise that stirring makes it worse, and that stopping, however long it takes to show its results, is always the kinder and more honest path forward. This exchange, passed down now through many generations of students who have told and retold it in their own words, offers something worth carrying with you as tonight too begins its own slow settling. There is no promise here that every night from this one forward will be easy, that you will never again lie awake fighting your own racing mind, that the teachings offered across this evening will work perfectly, every time, without fail. They will not. No teaching ever has, for anyone in any tradition, across the whole long history of restless minds trying to find their way toward rest. What is offered instead is something humbler, and in its own way more durable. The simple knowledge that stirring never actually helps, and that stopping, however long it takes to show its quiet results, is always available to you on this night and on every night still to come. This is worth sitting with gently, as our own evening together now begins its slow, unhurried journey toward its close. Across these past hours, we've walked through a great many images together. A jar of muddy water, settling on its own once the stirring hand withdrew. A wide open sky, holding every cloud that ever passed through it without once becoming the weather itself. A single arrow, and the choice available in any moment, not to fire a second one on top of it. An old innkeeper welcoming every guest without needing to judge whether they deserve to stay. A river, and a hand finally learning to watch without reaching in to grasp at the current. A farmer's shed, holding the day's unfinished tools, patient and unchanged, waiting for morning. A small boat, following its own breath across water both calm and stormy, needing nothing more than a steady, unhurried return. A cup, finally allowed to sit, unfilled, until it grew light again on its own. And a garden, wild in places, tended not through constant correction, but through gentle, patient presence. None of these images asked you to become someone different than who you already are. None of them promised that your mind would stop being a mind, busy and wandering and occasionally restless, exactly as minds have always been. They only offered, each in their own quiet way, the same single gentle permission. You do not have to fight your way into stillness tonight. You only have to stop stirring and let it come to you in its own time, at its own unhurried pace, the way it always eventually does. If your mind is still busy right now, even after everything we have walked through together this evening, that is completely all right. It does not mean any of this has failed. It only means tonight is a night that needs a little more settling than some others, which is simply what some nights are. For every person who has ever lain awake trying to find their way towards sleep, the mud is still allowed to be mud. The sky is still allowed to hold whatever weather it happens to be holding right now. There is no deadline on any of this. There is only the continuing, unhurried invitation to let it be, and to return gently as many times as tonight requires, to whichever image among all of these feels most like a hand you can rest in right now. Perhaps it is the water, and the simple relief of knowing you never had to clear it yourself. Perhaps it is the sky, wide enough to hold every storm that has ever passed through you, without once being changed by any of them. Perhaps it is the breath, patient and steady, asking only for your gentle, repeated return, rather than your constant vigilance. There is no single correct image for tonight. There is only whichever one happens to meet you exactly where you are right now, and you are welcome to let it hold you gently for as long as you need, without any obligation to remember its name by morning. We have come a long way together this evening, through water and sky and rivers and gardens, through an old innkeeper's fire and a boatman's small crossing and a tea master's quiet room. You do not need to remember any single one of these stories in order for tonight to have done its work. If one image stayed with you, the mud settling, the clouds drifting, the cup finally emptying, let that be enough. If nothing in particular stayed, and the whole evening simply washed over you like rain on a roof, while your body slowly grew heavier and heavier, that is enough too. There was never a correct way to listen tonight. There was only listening, however it happened, for however long you managed it, before sleep finally gently began to take you. Let your whole body settle now, one final time, fully and completely. Let your breath come and go on its own, without your needing to follow it any longer, the way waves arrive and recede on a calm shore long after anyone has stopped watching them. Let your shoulders sink their full weight into whatever is holding you. Let your hands rest open, empty, unclenched, exactly as they were always meant to be. Let your jaw soften, your forehead smooth, Your whole face let go of whatever small tensions it has carried through this long day and this long evening. There is nowhere left to arrive tonight. There is nothing left to solve, nothing left to settle, nothing left to tend before you are finally, fully allowed to rest. Feel the whole of this evening now, gathered quietly around you the way the last light gathers around an old wooden hut at the edge of a mountain, warm and dim and unhurried. Every story you have heard tonight, every image, every small and gentle permission is folded now into the same soft dark that is folding itself around your own tired body. You do not need to hold on to any of it any longer. You only need to let it settle, the way everything else this evening has settled, at its own pace, into its own quiet place, somewhere just beneath the surface of your thinking, ready to be found again on some future restless night, gently, quietly, whether you remember reaching for it or not, whether you remember any single word of this quiet evening at all by the time the soft light of morning finally, gently comes. May the grip ease wherever it has been holding on, and may it ease exactly as much as it is ready to ease tonight, no more and no less. May the racing mind find its way, in its own time, toward the quiet that has been waiting patiently underneath it this entire evening, the way sky waits beneath every passing storm. May the mud settle, low and undisturbed, at the bottom of whatever jar you have been carrying. May the second arrows go unfired tonight, and every night after this one that you can manage it. And may you be gentle with yourself on the nights you cannot. May the guests at your door find a warm fire and a quiet welcome, and may they leave again in their own time, exactly as every guest always does. May your hands stay open, unclenched, ungrasping, resting easily at your sides. May your unfinished tasks wait patiently in their shed until morning, needing nothing further from you tonight. May your breath carry you gently across whatever water lies between this moment and sleep. May your cup sit quietly, growing lighter with each passing minute. And may your garden, wild or ordered or somewhere quietly in between, simply be allowed tonight to grow into whatever shape it was always going to grow into anyway. And may you, whatever shape your own restless evening has taken, be granted that same quiet permission tonight to simply be exactly as you are, unfinished and unfixed, and to rest anyway. Sleep well. Thank you for spending these quiet hours here tonight, letting your mind finally, gently settle, the way water settles, the way clouds pass, the way every tired, restless thing eventually finds its way home to stillness. Whenever you are ready, let go completely and rest.